Cognitive bias. A cognitive bias is a pattern of deviation in judgment that occurs in particular situations. And it is also a kind of cognitive distortion. And implicit in the concept of a pattern of deviation is a standard of comparison. This may be the judgment of people outside those particular situations, or maybe a set of independently verifiable facts. The existence of some of these cognitive biases has been verified empirically in the field of psychology. Cognitive biases are instances of evolved mental behavior. Some are presumably adaptive, for example, because they lead to more effective actions or enable faster decisions. Others presumably result from a lack of appropriate mental mechanisms or from the misapplication of a mechanism that is adaptive under different circumstances. Decision making and behavioral biases. Many of these biases are studied for how they affect belief formation, business decisions, and even scientific research. 1. Bandwagon effect. The bandwagon effect. This is the tendency to believe things because many other people believe the same. This is related to groupthink and herd behavior. Next one, base rate fallacy. Ignoring available statistical data in favor of particulars. That is a base rate fallacy. Bias blind spot. The tendency not to compensate for one's own cognitive biases. Choice supportive bias. The tendency to remember one's choices as better than they actually were. That is a choice supportive bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency to search for or interpret information in a way that confirms one's preconceptions. That's a confirmation bias. Congruence bias, the tendency to test hypotheses exclusively through direct testing, in contrast to tests of possible alternative hypotheses. Contrast effect, the enhancement or diminishing of a weight or other measurement when compared with a recently observed contrasting object. Deformation professionnelle, the tendency to look at things according to the conventions of one's own profession, forgetting the broader point of view. Denomination effect, the tendency to spend more money when it is denominated in small amounts, especially coins, than large amounts. That's the denomination effect. That's why marketers, price their goods. For example, 4,999 rupees only. Sounds much lesser than 5,000. Distinction bias, the tendency to view two options as more dissimilar when evaluating them simultaneously than when evaluating them separately. The endowment effect is the fact that people often demand much more to give up an object than they would be willing to pay to acquire it. They demand much more to give it up than they would be willing to pay for it, pay to acquire it. That's the endowment effect. Experimenter's bias or expectation bias, the tendency for experimenters to believe, certify, and publish data that agree with their expectations for the outcome of an experiment, and to disbelieve, discard, or downgrade the corresponding weightings for data that appear to conflict with those expectations. Extraordinarity bias, the tendency to value an object more than others in the same category as a result of an extraordinarity of that object that does not in itself change the value. Focusing effect, prediction bias occurring when people place too much importance on one aspect of an event, causing error in accurately predicting the utility of a future outcome. Framing, using an approach or description of the situation on issue that is too narrow. Also framing effect, drawing different conclusions based on how data is presented. Hyperbolic discounting, the tendency for people to have a stronger preference for more immediate payoffs relative to later payoffs. Where the tendency increases, the closer to the present both payoffs are. Illusion of control, the tendency for human beings to believe they can control or at least influence outcomes that they clearly cannot. Impact bias, the tendency for people to overestimate the length or the intensity of the impact of future feeling states. Information bias, the tendency to seek information even when it cannot affect action. Irrational escalation, an irrational escalation is the tendency to make irrational decisions based upon rational decisions in the past or to justify actions already taken. Just world phenomena, witnesses of an inexplicable injustice. If you are a witness of an inexplicable injustice, there will be a tendency to rationalize it by searching for things that the victim might have done to deserve it. Loss aversion. The disutility of giving up an object is greater than the utility associated with acquiring it. It's similar to the endowment effect. Mere exposure effect. The important one, this is the tendency for people to express undue liking for things merely because they are familiar with them. That's the reason, as Christ said, prophet is never respected in his own land. A prophet is never respected in his own land. That is what you call mere exposure effect. Because you're familiar with something, you don't regard it with great worth. Money illusion. The tendency of people to concentrate on the nominal face value of money rather than its value in terms of purchasing power. That's right, your salary is not as important. The figures are not so important. The importance is actually, the importance lies in the purchasing power. Moral credential effect. The tendency of a track record of a non-prejudice, the tendency of a track record of non-prejudice to increase subsequent prejudice. Uh, and then need for closure. The need to reach a verdict in important matters, to have an answer and to escape the feeling of doubt and uncertainty. The personal context, time, social pressure might increase this bias. So the need for closure. Neglect of probability, the tendency to completely disregard probability when making a decision under uncertainty. Normalcy bias, the refusal to plan for or react to a disaster which has never happened before. Normalcy bias, not invented here, the tendency to ignore that a product or solution already exists because its source is seen as an enemy or as inferior. Omission bias, the tendency to judge harmful actions as worse or less moral than equally harmful omissions. Outcome bias, the tendency to judge a decision by its eventual outcome instead of based on the quality of the decision at the time it was made. Planning fallacy, the tendency to underestimate task completion times. Planning fallacy. Post-purchase rationalization, the tendency to persuade oneself through rational argument that a purchase was a good purchase. Post-purchase rationalization. Pseudo-certainty effect, the tendency to make risk-averse choices if the expected outcome is positive, but making risk-seeking choices to avoid negative outcomes. Reactance, the urge to do the opposite of what someone wants you to do out of a need to resist a perceived attempt to constrain your freedom of choice. That is reactance. That's a bias. You'll simply disobey because you feel that if you obey, your freedom has been in some way restrained. Restraint bias, the tendency to overestimate one's ability to show restraint in the face of temptation. Restraint bias, you think that you can resist the temptation, but you're overestimating your own ability. Actually, you may succumb. Selective perception, the tendency for expectations to affect perception. Expectations affect perceptions. And Semmelweis reflex, well, this is the name of a researcher, the tendency to reject new evidence that contradicts an established paradigm. Status quo bias, the tendency for people to like things to stay relatively the same. And von Restorff effect, the tendency for an item that stands out like a sore thumb to be more likely to be remembered than other items. Wishful thinking, the formation of belief that the making of decisions according to what is pleasing to imagine instead of by appeal to evidence or rationality. Making formation of beliefs or making decisions according to what is pleasing to imagine, that is, whatever is pleasant to your imagination, you believe in that. That's wishful thinking. And disregard evidence or rationality. Zero risk bias, preference for reducing a small risk to zero over a greater reduction in a larger risk. Now you see, biases in probability and belief. Many of these biases are often studied for how they affect business and economic decisions and how they affect experimental research. Ambiguity effect, the avoidance of options for which missing information makes the probability seem unknown. Anchoring effect, The tendency to rely too heavily or anchor on a past reference or of one trait or piece of information when making decisions. This can also be called insufficient adjustment. Attentional bias, neglect of relevant data when making judgments of a correlation or association. Authority bias is the tendency to value an ambiguous stimulus according to the opinion of someone who is seen as an authority on the topic. So just because it comes from a authoritative source, you begin to believe it. Availability heuristic, estimating what is more likely by what is more available in memory, which is biased toward vivid, unusual, or emotionally charged examples. Availability cascade, a self-reinforcing process in which a collective belief gains more and more plausibility through its increasing repetition in public discourses. When repeating something long enough, and it will become true. That's the kind of a availability cascade. More and more people, and then it becomes a what you call mania or mass hysteria. Belief bias, an effect when someone's evaluation of the logical strength of an argument is biased by the believability of the conclusion. You believe that the conclusion is likely, therefore you begin to believe the process itself and all that. Clustering illusion, the tendency to see patterns where actually none exist. You remember that movie, the what do you call, Sixth Sense? Oh, no, it's not the Sixth Sense. The Beautiful Mind, where there is a clustering illusion, the tendency to see patterns where actually no pattern exists. Capability bias, the tendency to believe that the closer average performance is to the target, the tighter the distribution of the data set. Conjunction fallacy, the tendency to assume that specific conditions are more probable than general ones. Disposition effect, the tendency to sell assets that have increased in value but hold assets that have decreased in value. Gambler's fallacy is the tendency to think that future probabilities are altered by past events, when in reality they are unchanged. Results from an erroneous conceptualization of the law of large numbers. For example, I have flipped heads with this coin 5 times consecutively, so the chance of tails coming out on the 6th flip is much greater than the heads. Now that's a gambler's fallacy. Hawthorne effect. Hawthorne effect is the tendency of people to perform or perceive differently when they know that they are being observed. This is an important experiment in management. So if people feel that they are being observed, they will perform better. Hindsight bias, sometimes called the he knew it all along effect. The inclination to see past events as being predictable. Inclination to see past events as being predictable, when in fact they are not. It's a very moot point. Illusory correlation, believes that inaccurately suppose a relationship between a certain type of action and an effect. Ludic fallacy, the analysis of chance-related problems according to the belief that the unstructured randomness found in life resembles the structured randomness found in games, ignoring the non-Gaussian distribution of many real-world results. Neglect of prior base rates effect, the tendency to neglect known odds when re-evaluating odds in light of weak evidence. Observer expectancy effect, when a researcher expects a given result and therefore unconsciously manipulates an experiment or misinterprets data in order to find it. Optimism bias, the systematic tendency to be over optimistic about the outcome of planned actions. Ostrich effect, ignoring an obvious negative situation. Overconfidence effect, excessive confidence in one's own answers to the questions. For example, for certain types of questions, answers that people rate as 99% turn out to be wrong 40% of the time. Positive outcome bias, a tendency in prediction to overestimate the probability of good things happening to them. It's similar to wishful thinking, optimism bias, and valence effect. Pareidolia, a vague and random stimulus, often an image or sound, is perceived as significant. Seeing images for animals or faces in clouds, the man in the moon, Sai Baba in the moon, and hearing hidden messages on records played in reverse. That's called pareidolia. Pareidolia. Primacy effect, the tendency to weigh initial events more than the subsequent events. Recency effect, the tendency to weigh recent events more than earlier events. Disregard of regression toward the mean, the tendency to expect extreme performance to continue. Selection bias, a distortion of evidence or data that arises from the way the data is being collected. Stereotyping, expecting a member of a group to have certain characteristics without having actual information about that individual. Sub-additivity effect, Subadditivity, the tendency to judge probability on the whole to be less than the probabilities of the parts. Subjective validation, perception that something is true if a subject's beliefs demands it to be true, also assigns perceived connection between coincidences. Telescoping effect, the effect that recent events appear to have occurred more remotely and remote events appear to have occurred more recently. This is the telescoping effect. The Texas sharpshooter fallacy. The Texas sharpshooter fallacy is the fallacy of selecting or adjusting a hypothesis after the data is collected, making it impossible to test the hypothesis fairly. Refers to the concept of firing shots at a barn door, drawing a circle around the best group, and declaring that to be the target. First you shoot, and then go there and draw a circle around the place where you have hit and claim that you have hit the target. So most of these biases are also there. Social biases are also there. Attributional biases are there. Action observer bias, for example, the tendency for explanations of other individuals' behaviors to overemphasize the influence of their personality and underemphasize the influence of their situation. Uh, Sometimes this is coupled with the opposite tendency for the self, in that explanations for our own behaviors overemphasize the influence of our situation and underemphasize the influence of our own personality. Egocentric bias occurs when people claim more responsibility for themselves for the results of a joint action than an outsider observer would. Forer effect or Barnum effect is the tendency to give high accuracy ratings to descriptions of their personality that supposedly are tailored specifically for them, but are in fact vague and general enough to apply to a wide range of people. This is how horoscopes and astrologers and tarot card readers benefit because of the Forer effect. You tend to give higher accuracy ratings to descriptions of their personality, which appear as if they have been tailored specifically for you, but in fact they are vague and general enough to apply to a wide range of people. False consensus effect, the tendency for people to overestimate the degree to which others agree with them. Fundamental attribution error, the tendency for people to overemphasize personality based explanations for behaviors observed in others while underemphasizing the role and power of situational influence on the same behavior. Halo effect is the tendency for a person's positive or negative traits to spill over from one area of their personality to another in others' perceptions of them. Herd instinct is the common tendency to adopt the opinions and follow the behaviors of the majority to feel safer and to avoid conflict. Illusion of asymmetric insight, people perceive their knowledge of their peers to surpass their peers' knowledge of them. Illusion of transparency, people overestimate others' ability to know them, and they also overestimate their ability to know others. Illusory superiority, overestimating one's desirable qualities and underestimating undesirable qualities relative to other people. It can also be called superiority bias. In-group bias, the tendency for people to give preferential treatment to others they perceive to be members of their own groups. Just world phenomena, the tendency for people to believe that the world is just and therefore people get what they deserve. Notational bias is a form of cultural bias in which a notation increases the appearance of a non-existent natural law. Out-group homogeneity bias, individuals see members of their own group as being relatively more varied than members of other groups. That is the out-group homogeneity bias. Projection bias, the tendency to unconsciously assume that others share the same or similar thoughts, beliefs, values, or positions. That's the projection bias. Self-serving bias or behavioral confirmation effect, the tendency to claim more responsibility for successes than failures. It may also manifest itself as a tendency for people to evaluate ambiguous information in a way beneficial to their interests, or it can also be called the group serving bias. Self-fulfilling prophecy is the tendency to engage in behaviors that elicit results which will or confirm existing attitudes. That's the self-fulfilling prophecy. System justification is the tendency to defend and bolster the status quo. Existing social, economic, and political arrangements tend to be preferred, and alternatives disparaged, sometimes even at the expense of individual and collective self-interest. Trait ascription bias, the tendency for people to view themselves as relatively variable in terms of personality, behavior, and mood, while viewing others as much more predictable. Ultimate attribution error, similar to the fundamental attribution error. In this error, a person is likely to make an internal attribution to an entire group instead of the individuals within the group. And you have similar memory errors also. Memory consistency bias, incorrectly remembering one's past attitudes and behavior as resembling a present attitudes and behavior. Cryptomnesia is a form of misattribution where a memory is mistaken for imagination. Egocentric bias is recalling the past in a self-serving manner. Example, remembering one's own exam grades as being better than they were, or remembering a caught fish as being bigger than it actually was. False memory, confusion of imagination with memory, or the confusion of true memories with false memories. Hindsight bias is filtering memory of past events through present knowledge so that these events look more predictable than they actually were. Also known as the he knew it all along effect. Reminiscence bump, the effect that people tend to recall more personal events from adolescence and earlier adulthood than from other lifetime periods. Rosy retrospection, the tendency to rate past events more positively than they had actually rated them when the event occurred. Self-serving bias is perceiving oneself responsible for desirable outcomes but not responsible for the undesirable ones. Suggestibility, a form of misattribution where ideas suggested by a questioner are mistaken for memory. A common theoretical causes of some cognitive biases: attribution substitution, making a complex, difficult judgment by unconsciously substituting an easier judgment. Attribution theory, especially salience, cognitive dissonance, and related impression management, self-perception theory. Heuristics, including availability heuristic, estimating what is more likely by what is more available in memory, which is biased toward vivid, unusual, or emotionally charged examples. Representativeness heuristic is judging probabilities on the basis of resemblance. Affect heuristic is basing a decision on an emotional reaction rather than a calculation of risks and benefits. Adaptive biases, misinterpretation or misuse of statistics, all these things. So, cognitive biases. And on this basis, we make a lot of beliefs.